All right, you're listening to The Harboring Light. I'm Mary. Give a conservative take on the world around me. So this episode is all about Australia, and particularly I'm going to focus in on the historical cuisine and how that leads to the aspect of food of modern Australia and how that all that correlates. And I think it's interesting and how understanding those aspects, it ties into the development of food, and it particularly the development of a cultural aspect of how they're from different cultures, how their cuisine is seen and presented around the world, and then also is thought of in America too. All right, so instead of diving in, let's dig in. According to, of course, I will provide the link for the source in this episode. So according to the source, the growing atmosphere for Australian food has been evolving in a pattern with migration since the Chinese gold rush. So it says the prospectors began sharing food in the 1900s. It says Chinese restaurants emerged as a commercial enterprise on the Victorian goldfields. And this is quoted by Barbara Nickel in a paper entitled Sweet and Sour History, Melbourne's Early Chinese History. So, in the first half of the 20th century, the Chinese restaurant was one of the most visible symbols of cultural diversity in Sydney. So it says by 1890, 1/3 of all cooks in Australia were Chinese, operating cook shops to serve Chinese diggers a hot meal from back rooms of other businesses. The majority of Chinese settlers came from southern China's Guangdong province. So Cantonese food was on the menu. Little wonder than that, the cooks were soon serving people from all nationalities, not only the Chinese. Even with the Australian policy, it drew a halt to the Chinese immigration in 1901. Special visa favors were made for Chinese chefs. By 1930s, cook shops has evolved in a standalone restaurant. Okay, so let me make some commentary about this before I go on further. So with this aspect of the Australian policy with halting Chinese immigration, it's one of these things that, you got to see things from different sides. It's one thing to go through the immigration process, to go through everything in a proper manner, and it's great, and to become a citizen of the country. And then it's also one thing to keep in mind about policy and procedures. Now, not everything is corrupt, and that's unfortunate. But on the other hand, that there is a limitation to everything as far as the migration status and keeping everything intact in the countries. And I don't know, it's helpful to see everything from different points of views. And then it's just a whole thing is reflecting also to what we are going on in our times. So, it's just always a good rule of thumb to do things in good faith. Because if you're going to do something, if you're going to go into a country, you got to keep in mind about the process of doing things the legal way. And then you also got to keep in mind when you go through all the process and you meet the standards and you get in, you got to also keep in mind about the aspects of capacity. Because, things can only be open for so long, and limitation is really crucial to the development of a country. And then all this backward forward procedure policies about, I think the border should be open. I think this, I think that. What's the harm in that? There's a lot of harm that could happen, and the aspect of not having all these things in mind. And it's just a good rule of thumb also to have a rationality about situations like this. But it's quite interesting with the aspect of how, particularly with food, when the influx of different cultures change the aspect of the main dishes from a country, and how that helps to change the perspective about food. And it's fascinating to me. All right, so let's keep going. So by the 1930s, cook shops had evolved into standalone restaurants. 18 were listed in the trade directories in 1820. And Nicole notes that, and this goes back to the paper that I was talking about earlier, about the Chinese history of Melbourne. All right, it says, and Nicole notes that they were frequented by city workers, students, recently arrived refugees from Europe, and Melbourne's bohemian community of artists and writers. Now, the same was happening in Chinatown and Sydney, as Nicole had said during a National Library of Australian presentation. In the first half of the 20th century, the Chinese restaurant was one of the most visible symbols of cultural diversity in Sydney. So, moving on to the Italian influence. So the Italians were not far behind. Italians have been in Australia since James Marta and Antonio Ponto landed with the first fleet. It wasn't until the influx of migration following World War II that they began making their culinary mark. Italian market gardeners and greengrocers took over fruit and vegetable markets from the Chinese, whose numbers were dwindling due to, and then again, they keep mentioning the white Australia policy. So I don't know what to make of that. But, yeah. And it says, it is hard to believe that vegetables that we now take for granted, such as eggplants and zucchini, were virtually unknown to the Australian public. Vicky Swinback writes in A Brief History of the Development of Italian Cuisine in Australia, it must have been a real culture shock for Italians coming to Australia in the early days and being confronted with the Australian way of eating at the time. So a diet consisting largely of meat, often 3 times a day, a very limited range of vegetables, all washed down with gallons of tea. So Italians started growing the vegetables they needed to create traditional dishes, and it was only a matter of time before their food moved from market to retail to restaurant. So King and Godfrey and Carlton began specializing in Italian food and wine of the 50s. And it went on to open I believe the pronunciation of this is Bellamobati family went on to open Frank Agnasno and the Koi grocery stores across Melbourne. One of the first stores that opened is now a Legon food store, which still sells high quality Italian produce and supplies. And then it's also how this aspect transitions into America, how we see as in the height of the 1900s on to the start of the 20th century, and centering around the Industrial Revolution, and then everything going through the Staten Island, in New York, and being the beckoning for immigrants to come and start a new life for themselves. It really is reflecting of this too, how all these different communities, Irish, Polish, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, all these things, Korean, how bringing in their traditions, it changed the cultural cuisine of America. So, for instance, the Italian influence with the aspect of fruits and vegetables and things of that nature being more of a balance of the way things were eaten as meals in America. And then also the aspect of Spanish foods and Spanish influence of writing and the Spanish influence of spelling things, how that gazpacho, things like that, potato, things like that, how that influenced and leaked into the language of American culture. All right, so here we go. Let's go into Greek milk bars. So the Greeks had a similar experience when arriving in Australia. Although rather than the produce markets, it was in milk bars and cafes where they found their groove. The traditional Greek cafes began and it arrived in 1877 in Sydney and opened a fish and chip shop on Oxford Street in 1879. So working with fish seemed a natural fit for the island-born Greeks, and plenty of fellows quickly followed of the Greek heritage quickly followed. So the Australian seafood industry was heavy with the wholesale entrepreneurs of Greek descendants, and it lists, for example, the Poulos, Kalisis, forgive my pronunciation, just to name a few, are just some of the Greek families who continue to be highly regarded operations. All right, so by the 30s, the Paragon Cafe opened. By the 1930s, the National Trust listed for the Paragon Cafe to open. So in 1916, by Zachariah and Simos, and closed in May of 2018. So this is the existence and the establishment leaking on from what I understand about this cafe, about the origin of everything. And that's how it sustained all the different changes and generation. It closed in May of 2018. That's really remarkable, especially going in and thinking from a business point of view. So typically, I kind of knew this. I kind of knew this, but I learned it even more. But so when I graduated from college, I got a contract job, and particularly with working for the business department of U of H. And so I learned a lot of different things about the ins and outs about business. And while working there, it was a running thing and a running theme that, especially when you get into the aspect of a restaurant and being lucrative with restaurants, those are a risk-taking ventures. And it's quite remarkable when people get into the restaurant industry and they establish and they make a name for themselves, and they're very successful. And it's a true testament of will when it comes to things like that, I think. So the Paragon Cafe was probably the first to start selling traditional Greek food. Let me say that again. Okay. One more time, y'all. Selling traditional Greek food when it offered baklava and things like this in the 1930s. And it soon introduced many Greek dishes, and it remains a staple of the milk bar culture across Australia. So here we go to Thai. Just as Italian and Greek food was growing fast acceptance, another new kid on the block, so to speak. But those who know, you know what I'm talking about. Was buying their way into the weird lunchbox territory. So, as the title goes, Thai Town, along with Campbell Street in Sydney, was officially recognized by the city of Sydney in 2013. But Thai grocers and retailers have been operating along the strip since the 70s. So in 76, to be exact, the Bon Thai, Australia's first Thai restaurant, opened on St. Killadai Road in Mai in Sydney, quickly followed. It's fair to say that they haven't stopped opening them since. It's quite interesting. So, out of this, it was a non-Thai who put Australian-style Thai food on the world map. David Tomlinson, Darling Street, the Thai, and the Sailor's Thai, both closed, fortunately, and then modernized the Thai food in Australia in the 1990s. So Thompson went on to open 9 in London, and I guess, closed as to revamp their style as far as their cuisine. So from what I'm understanding, looking at this now, from understanding that, that's a good thing to, you have a vision in mind, and to stop and rethink and to rebrand and to refocus everything on a better plan and on to be more lucrative. It's a good process. So Thomas then opened Long Chim in Perth in 2015. So this was in Sydney in 2016 and in Melbourne and in 2017. So a celebration of Thai street of food and the kind of Thai cooking popping up more and more was going on more and more in Australia. So Vietnamese refugees fleeing from the devastation of the Vietnam War also brought a little street food magic with them. Pho. By this time, Australia was well into Cantonese food, with a Chinese restaurant mandatory in every town. But lemon chicken and sweet and sour pork did not quite prepare the population for the fragrant broth that would eventually become a national obsession. So the Vietnamese community began opening family-run restaurants to feed their own in working-class suburbs like Melbourne's Richmond and Footscray and Sydney. So for many, cooking let me say that again. So for many, starting out with the cooking elements was a way to some money while attending English classes. So that's quite interesting, learning how a skillful, learning how to cook can be a very skillful trade, and that helping them to learn English so they can develop in the country. And that's something that they have a good attitude to understand and respect other cultures, the culture that you want to live in and make a life for yourself in. So, it would be, it's really something to say about that. Because when you go into other lands, other countries, and, and mingle and understand other nationalities, it's always important to keep that in mind, to respect their language, to respect their culture. And then when you have that mentality, it'll help you become a well-rounded person and be able to communicate so much better, because a lot of issues, of course, life doesn't work like that. Not everything is so simple, but a lot of times, a lot of barriers happen and a lot of problems happen due to the lack of communication or misunderstanding. And then when you have that mentality in mind, especially when you want to be successful, I see that's a keystone to wanting to be successful, to learn the language in which the country you want to live in. That's very meritable. That's very noble. And also another thing to point out, how this is a running theme that, the immigrants, when they're coming to another country and they want to live in, the ones that want to make a name for themselves, the ones that want to really be successful, they're all about giving back and supporting their community and having their families with them and making it through everything together, because that's what it's all about. That's, I can't stress that enough. If you have those kind of values where you understand the importance of family and understand of giving back and helping in your community, it makes everything a lot simpler in life, to where you get to the root of what's really important. And that helps to also keep in mind to make things better and more successful, and alleviate a lot of problems that, particularly even more so now that we're facing in our society. And that's great. All right, so most cooks were amateurs who turned to cooking to earn a modest income. All right, so here we go. So it's going on to the aspect of the growing influx of different cultures in Australia. So it proposes this question in the article. It says, who knows what happens next? Since the grunt work has been done by Chinese, Italian, Greek, Thai, and Vietnamese cooks and growers, Australian cuisine has gone on to embrace dishes and techniques from every country, including Korea, Indian, Polish, Mexican, Russian, Japanese, Danish, Samoan. There's simply no room to list them all. And it says, what was once deemed as foreign food is now just the way to eat around here. So it goes on to say, no doubt will continue, as in the Australian article, the Australian writer that wrote this is saying about their country, not as in reference of me saying this. So, no doubt we'll continue to blend and mash and merge dishes to forge the next evolution of Australian food. And that's quite a good thing to end on, to as far as this article goes, to see the prospect and the aspect of welcoming different cultures. And that's a good thing to reflect on as far as the aspect of this idea of how that is reflective to in other countries with the American phrase of a melting pot, so to speak, and how and accepting that narrative and that idea, it helps to evolve the aspect of nationality. Now, also keep in mind this too, having respect of the predominant nationality and your roots and the foundation of where the country started. And that's also something to keep in mind too. So what I'm leading towards by saying this is today, unfortunately, we see all this aspect of the Black national anthem, or only wanting this, or only want to be this in a safe space, and all those are counterintuitive things that keep us from progress. And it's also a thing, too, to keep in mind that it takes away from the sense of national pride of your country and where you come from. Because, me being American, I'm very blessed that I was able to be raised and born in a country where you have I'm so tongue tied today. You have the inalienable rights. I just can't say it today. I'm sorry, y'all, but y'all know what I'm saying. You have the innate rights to be productive. You're not restrained and unfortunately that's a thing that happens in Europe and different countries of Europe and Spain, from what understanding, from the history, and in other parts of the world, and your family and where you came from and who you are, your name and everything else is tied to the aspect of the rest of your life. And, class system is a real thing. And then when you get into the aspect of the free market and capitalism, an aspect of not being restricted or persecuted due to religious aspects too, that's another thing to be immensely grateful for and to think about and appreciate, because that happens in a lot of countries too, where your freedom of speech and then your freedom of religion, those are things that you can't go against or have a say into how you want to view things. And then the fact of having the aspect of not being prideful of your country is particularly, now it being prevalent to say, oh, it's a shameful thing to be an American, which is, I don't think you're really understanding everything. And then also another thing is really important when you go into other countries and to travel, to see the aspect of the notion that with traveling, should do from my point of view. And as I mentioned previously, I can't wait till I can start doing it, start traveling. 2, it's supposed to be a thing that enriches you, not a thing that makes you disdained or bitter about the world. And it should help you to have more of an appreciation and more of, it's really a synonym is the same thing, but I can't stress it enough to give thanks to the world around us. So, on that note, this reaches the end of the man, I'm just tongue-tied today, y'all. This reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care. Bye-bye now.